Why exactly were there so many handguns made during the Great War? Why does there seem to be a particular emphasis on the handguns of the Great War? And that's because more often than any other point in history were they so prevalent.
Before the Great War, the only handgun use was really with officers, and usually that is a badge of rank and to be used in extreme cases when they were overrun. As a matter of fact, in the American Civil War, they often said you could tell when things really went bad when you could hear the pop, pop, pop of the officers' revolvers. You knew that it had broken through. Otherwise, it was a cavalry.
You were literally running into an overlap in history. Here we had the end of what we call linear tactics meeting modern technology. We had the first major global conflict in mankind's history on this type of a scale, and we're looking at the end of the era of black powder and the evolution of smokeless powder, which allows us to have semi-automatics and full automatic machine guns. But yet our generals were still guys that grew up in the old black powder age and didn't understand this transformation that was taking place on the battlefield.
In June 1914, a man named Gavrilo Princip fired 2 shots that changed the world. His actions led to war between Austria and Serbia. Serbian handguns in the Great War were really influenced by their region, the Balkans. There are a lot of different guns in Serbia, but mostly Gasser revolvers.
The Gasser revolver is always of interest to anyone going through a gun show because they look so improbable. They have a bag type grip, very small grip, a monstrous receiver, and a huge cylinder, and they just look entirely ungainly.
You got to consider that this is an 1870 design. This is a cartridge revolver. It's made 3 years before Colt develops the single-action Army. It's made as Smith & Wesson is developing its Model 3 American that eventually became the Russian and the Schofield design. And they started with a carbine cartridge, for crying out loud, and they created probably the biggest cartridge revolver of the 19th century, probably firing the biggest cartridge of the 19th century.
They were very common and widespread throughout the Balkans. And I'm sure a great many of them saw combat, not necessarily directly related to the First World War. They could have been used against each other or their neighbors or their people over on the other side of the mountain.
There are 2 basic types of the large Montenegrin Gasser revolvers. One is the open top, where you just have the barrel, the naked cylinder with no top strap on it, and then the grip and the frame. And then there's a top brake model. It's beautiful in its weirdness.
Serbia's ally, Montenegro, has left a legacy in handguns, and that's to be the butt of many jokes. They don't look terribly safe, but that is emblematic of that part of the world. If you think about the Balkans, you think about these just huge, garish Montenegrin service revolvers. When the great powers went to war in 1914, no one, and I mean no one, foresaw the huge need for handguns that the trenches and the battlefields of this war would require. Tsarist Russia was trying to modernize its arms program. So you had guns like the Belgian-designed 1895 Nagant, as well as the Smith & Wesson Russian from the 1870s.
The Russians were casting about for a replacement revolver back in the 1870s. And they settled on a Smith & Wesson, which Smith & Wesson made thousands of these for the Tsarist government in a special cartridge, the 44 Smith & Wesson Russian. But by the early 1890s, the Russians were looking for a replacement for this, and they settled on a design by Emile Nagant, a Belgian. The Nagant revolver was unique in that it had a cartridge in which the bullet was seated down inside the neck of the cartridge, and when it was fired, the cylinder itself rotated and was forced up against the throat of the barrel and setting up a supposed gas check.
The Nagant 1895 has a characteristic that you see in a lot of Russian military firearms, and that is that it is hell for stout. It is reliable, it is durable, it's going to stand up under neglect and abuse. They said that if something goes wrong with it, you can fix it with a hammer or a big rock. So basically a very reliable gun, firing a relatively small caliber cartridge, but certainly served the Russian army for decades.
If they survive the baptism of fire that we know as the Great War and show up again in World War II, there's something positive to be said about the practicality and the efficiency of those firearms. And in the case of the Nagant, we see those again in World War II, not out of necessity, but out of practicality.
The Austro-Hungarian Empire was big, expansive, and really polyglot. A lot of different cultures were involved here, and that same ethos runs through the country's pistols.
In the Austro-Hungarian Empire, pistol design suffered from the basic social and political schisms that were inherent in the birthplace of those designs. Fortunately, they had a few geniuses. They had Karol Krinka. They had Ferdinand von Mannlicher. Without those two guys, they would have been lost.
The Rothsteyr of 1907 is a striker fire design, presaging many modern designs. It was adopted in 1907, one of the earliest semi-automatic handguns adopted by a major military power.
What is remarkable about the Rothsteyr is the precise machining of that gun. They hogged the Rothsteyr out of a solid block of steel with walls of the receiver that encased the barrel, in which the recoil spring and other things were situated. Even today with fine precision CNC machinery and all that, I doubt that we could do better.
These 2 decades, the 1890s, the early 1900s, you're looking at people working the kinks out of how are we going to make these semi-automatic pistols work. And the Rothsteyr was certainly a step forward in that. It was a pretty reliable, pretty effective semi-automatic pistol that gave good military service. The Steyr Hahn was developed around 1911. It was named the model 1912. But it really wasn't adopted by the military until 1914.
The Steyr Hahn was a refined Rothsteyr. Contrary to what is sometimes said about it, it is not a delayed blowback. It is fully locked. It has 3 sets of lugs that are all interrelated, so the gun works. I love the conception, because here is a totally original idea that obviously sprang out of somebody's mind.
Another pistol used by Austro-Hungarian forces was the Frommer stop pistol, designed by Rudolf Frommer, a fairly distinguished arms designer. It was adopted by the Hungarians in 1912. And this is a small gun. This is a recoil-operated pistol, which is unusual for a gun of its size, but it became standard in Hungarian forces in 1912.
The formative years of Austrian designs, in which one could argue that they were well ahead of the rest of the world. Unfortunately, they were all mixed up politically, and the Hungarian side of the Austro-Hungarian Empire was always at odds with the Austrian side, and so it was trying to create a coherent weapons system in a country like that was a real task.